Thank you, Mr. Chair and Kyrsten. Thank you so much for being here today. I have a couple of questions about the bill, and I was wondering, do you have the striker in front of you?
I do not, but
you probably know it.
I should have some idea of it.
I had a concern about on page 4 under section 3. There's subsection 13-1509, and this is the portion of the striker that makes it a crime for a person to fail to complete or carry their alien registration documents if they are here without legal status, as defined under 1304E or 1306A. I'm on lines 10 through 12 on page 4.
Page 4. Okay.
So I think there's some concerns here. So, and I know a number of people who have legal status in this country. So if a person who has a permanent resident alien card, or sometimes called a green card, uses that card to gain access to employment, etc. And because that card is very difficult to get, it takes about 6 months to get it. And if it were lost or destroyed, it takes another 6 months to get it. And so during that time where you don't have the card with you, you still retain your legal status, but you don't have the physical proof. So many people who have a resident alien card actually photocopy that card and keep the photocopy with them while keeping the actual document at home, because its legal tender is even more valuable than a birth certificate. It's harder to get, it takes longer, etc. And so I'm wondering, would a photocopy, which is what many people already carry, be sufficient to meet the requirements of this portion of the statute?
Mr. Chairman, Sinema, this simply mirrors federal law. And what I didn't want to do, federal law. So that's why it mirrors federal law, and they do not allow a photocopy to be on you. It says you must have that indicia on you.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Pierce, I understand that when individuals who have a legal status in this country are going to court to alter their status or are engaging in some kind of interaction with a government entity, they do bring their card. The concern that I would have is that if someone has their card and they are mugged, which just happened to me while I was in Washington, D.C. 3 weeks ago. I was mugged walking down the street. If someone is mugged and their wallet is stolen and they're an Arizona citizen, if you're a legal citizen in the United States and you have an Arizona driver's license, you can go get a new driver's license in a day. It's very easy. But to replace your alien registration card, your green card, would take up to 6 months. And so that person would have legal status in this country but would not be walking around with that in their wallet for 6 months. Under this statute, it would now be a state crime for that person to walk around without that ID, even if they had been mugged and it had been stolen. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, let me address it 2 ways. First of all,
Representative Seal.
Yeah, forgive me, Mr. Chair.
No
I do have
here. So I hear what Mr. Pierce is saying. Mr. Chair, Mr. Pierce, my concern is a continuing concern. If a person doesn't have their alien registration document on them, but they are a legal permanent resident, so they have legal status in this country, maybe it's document like a student visa, or maybe they have a work permit, but they are here in the country legally. If they don't have that document with them, what I heard from Mr. Pierce is that there would be a time where they were held in custody until their status was determined. That concerns me a little bit because someone who's committed no crime and has engaged in no illegal activity, hasn't done anything wrong, and through no fault of their own doesn't have their card with them, could be subjected to a loss of liberty for that time period. But my other question is...
May I just address that for you, Ron? Mr. Chairman, may I address it?
My concern still carries, because while I feel better hearing you say that most people's issues will be resolved, if there's any individual in this country who has to lose their liberty because of a situation that is not their own fault, I feel...
But, Mr. Chairman, to that point, it is their own fault. They're required by law to have that. And the officer is simply due diligence. That's all we're asking for here.
Right, but Mr. Chair, Mr. Pierce, if I was mugged and I don't have my documents, then it's not all of the person who mugged me. And I hope someone catches him and puts him in prison because he mugged me. However, it's still, there are situations where someone may not have their documents and it's no fault of their own.
But just to that point.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Pierce, if I could ask my next question.
Yes,
my next question is, what about a cop comes up to an individual and asks that person for their alien identification card? And that person says, I don't have an alien identification card. And then the officer begins to process that person. There are many situations where a person doesn't have an alien card and has legal right to be in this country if they're a U.S. citizen. They may not have the proof of their U.S. citizenship because if they were mugged, for instance, then they don't have their ID with them. There's also times when a person is a legal resident and may not have an ID card that they've received yet. So, for instance, you can have legal status in this country long before you actually get your legal permanent resident card. Or you can have a visa and be a legal student in this country before getting that documentation. So what happens during that window of time where a person has status and yet doesn't have physical proof of it? If, from what I understand, what Mr. Pierce is saying, if the police officer calls ICE and ICE is unable to locate that person in a database, then that person is subject to being held and losing their liberty until that case is resolved, even though they have committed no crime and have done nothing wrong.
Mr. Chairman, if I might respond.
Yes.
And again, I appreciate the concern, Representative, and I honestly do. I trust these folks. They do this every day. They do this every day to verify your information if you're maintaining something. That's why.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually the next section I have questions about is Section 4F on page 3, which relates to exactly what you mentioned. So starting on line 9, this section says, a person may bring an action in superior court to challenge any official or agency of this state or a county, city, town, or other political subdivision of this state that adopts or implements a policy or practice that limits or restricts the enforcement of federal immigration laws to less than the full extent permitted by federal law. So this would allow an individual, any individual in the state, a civil right to sue if any officer is practicing anything that limits or restricts the enforcement of federal immigration laws to less than the full extent permitted by federal law. And the reason that I think it interprets that way is because the word or is there. So you don't have to adopt a policy. You could just implement a policy. It doesn't have to be a policy. It just has to be a practice. So if someone is implementing a practice that limits or restricts the enforcement of federal immigration laws to less than the full extent permitted by federal law, then any individual in the state who feels like that city is practicing behavior less than the full extent permitted by the law, they have a civil right of action. And I think that's going to be incredibly costly for local governments. But I just want to see, if you all have considered this. So if an officer responds to a domestic disturbance phone call, and unfortunately we have a lot of domestic disturbance phone calls at the local level. If an officer responds to one of those calls and goes out to the home, if he or she does not inquire into the status of the victim, or if he does not report the victim to ICE, if he has reason to believe that she may be undocumented, would that allow the spouse who's been abusing her to sue? So here's the scenario. Couples together, spouse is a citizen, and he's beating up on woman. She may or may not be undocumented. She, tired of the abuse, calls the police. Police come out. My understanding of this section is that if the police don't report her to ICE, or if they don't inquire into her status, and if they don't report her to ICE for being undocumented, the husband could sue the state or the city, depending on who the arresting agency was. So if it was the city of Phoenix, they could sue the city of Phoenix for failure to inquire into her legal status and report her to ICE, continuing the cycle of abuse to that very woman. Am I incorrect in assuming that that's what could happen to a city here?
Mr. Chair, Representative Sinema. Formerly, I worked in the domestic violence field, and I would fully anticipate that the abuser would do such a thing to further control the life of that woman or man, depending upon genders and who was the abuser.